Adrian Kane had been alive for so long that he no longer feared death, he feared eternity. For 5 centuries, he had wandered through time, untouched by age, wealth accumulating in his wake like a tide he could no longer control. He had seen empires fall, kings turn to dust, and the stars shift above his head. Yet one thing had remained constant. Every lifetime, she came back to him, and every lifetime, he lost her. Tonight, standing in the heart of New York's elite, he felt the weight of time pressing down on him. The Sinclair Foundation Gala was a dazzling display of wealth and power, a grand ballroom filled with men who measured their worth in billions, and women who wore diamonds as effortlessly as they breathed. Adrian played his part well. He wore the crisp black tuxedo, sipped the aged whiskey, and offered the occasional sharp-edged smile. He was a ghost, wrapped in fine tailoring, an enigma the world wanted to solve, but never could, because Adrian Kane had no past, at least not one anyone could trace. And then he saw her, a flash of deep brown hair, a red satin dress, and eyes that hit him like a blade to the chest. His grip on the whiskey glass tightened. No, not again. Adrian turned sharply, a practiced escape. He had spent lifetimes avoiding this moment, the cruel joke that fate played every few decades. He knew what came next, the unbearable pull, the inevitable tragedy, but fate had never been kind to him. Mr. Kane, her voice stopped him, soft, smooth, yet laced with curiosity. Adrian exhaled slowly before turning to face her. She stood just a few feet away, her brown eyes fixed on him with a mixture of confidence and hesitation. "I'm Eleanor Hart," she said, offering her hand. "Journalist for the Manhattan Review." A journalist. Wonderful. Adrian hesitated before taking her hand. The contact sent a sharp jolt through him, an electric current of memories long buried. A field of lavender, a fire-lit ballroom in 18th century England, a battlefield drenched in blood. Her breath hitched. Had she felt it too? "You're a hard man to track down, Mr. Kane." She smiled, but there was a glint of something else in her expression, something searching, uncertain. "I prefer it that way," Adrian said smoothly, slipping his hand from hers. "I don't do interviews." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "That's funny, because you don't seem to have a past either." The words were innocent, but they cut deeper than she could ever know. Adrian's smile never faltered. "Perhaps I was born for the future." Eleanor laughed. A genuine sound, light and warm. It wasn't the reaction he had expected. "Clever," she said, "but that only makes me more interested." Adrian should have walked away, should have let her think of him as another reclusive billionaire with a manufactured history. But the universe had a cruel way of reintroducing them, life after life, like a loop he could never escape. And worse, he knew exactly how this would end, with her death. Adrian's fingers curled into a fist at his side. He would not, could not, go through it again. "I'm afraid you'll be disappointed," he said. "There's nothing interesting about me." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "That's what everyone who's interesting says." Adrian barely heard her. His senses had sharpened, because across the room, someone else had arrived. A man in a dark suit, standing unnaturally still, golden eyes gleaming in the candlelight. Valerian, the custodian of time. Adrian clenched his jaw. Of course, the bastard always showed up when Eleanor returned. A silent reminder that fate could not be outrun. Valerian met his gaze, a slow smirk playing on his lips. A warning. Adrian swallowed back the growing dread and turned back to Eleanor. "I have to go," he said abruptly. She frowned. "Did I say something wrong?" He shook his head. "Not yet." Eleanor watched as he strode away, confusion clouding her features. Adrian didn't look back. If he did, he might never leave. And if he stayed, if he let her in, he would lose her all over again. Xiaofai. From the shadows of the grand ballroom, Valerian swirled the drink in his hand, watching Adrian retreat. Predictable as always. It amused him really, watching Adrian fight a battle he had already lost. Time was not a thing one could escape, and yet, Adrian Kane had spent centuries trying to rewrite a story that had already been written in blood. Valerian sighed, sipping his wine. "Fool," he murmured, because what Adrian didn't realize was that this time, things were already different. Something had shifted, a ripple in the timeline. For the first time, Eleanor had felt the pull before she knew the truth, and that meant the cycle had already started to break. Valerian smiled to himself. Perhaps this would be interesting after all. Eleanor Hart was not easily dismissed. Most men in Adrian Kane's world, billionaires, heirs, politicians, spoke in rehearsed soundbites and sweated under the weight of her questions. They feared exposure, terrified of the truth. But Adrian? He wasn't afraid. He was something else, something impossible. She leaned against the bar of the Sinclair Gala, swirling her untouched champagne as she replayed their conversation. His storm gray eyes, the way his touch had sent a jolt of something through her, the way her own body had reacted, like it had known him before. And then there was his past, or rather, the lack of one. If you're enjoying the video, please help me by subscriing to the channel. It will make a huge difference and help me a lot. Adrian Kane had seemingly appeared out of nowhere 15 years ago, building a global empire overnight. That wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. Eleanor took out her phone and scrolled through her notes. No documented family, no childhood records. The first public appearance on record? A photo at a gala in London, looking exactly the same as he did tonight. Not a single wrinkle, not a single change. A chill ran down her spine. She glanced across the ballroom, searching for him, but Adrian Kane had vanished. Again. Eleanor's fingers danced over her laptop keyboard, eyes darting between search results. If Adrian was hiding something, she was going to find out what. The problem was, there was nothing to find. No birth certificate, no school records, no medical history, no ex-business partners. For a man with more wealth than half of Europe combined, Adrian Kane was a ghost. She exhaled, rubbing her temples. Maybe she was overthinking this. Billionaires had power, connections. If someone like Adrian wanted to erase his past, he probably could. But why go that far? And why did it feel like she was chasing something bigger than just a man with secrets? She clicked on an old event article from 2011, scanning for anything useful. But as she stared at the photo of Adrian, her stomach clenched. It wasn't the suit, it wasn't the hair, it was his eyes. Because they were the exact same eyes from her dream last night. She had been standing in a grand ballroom, not this one, but somewhere else. Someone else. A massive chandelier loomed above, casting candlelight across a crowd dressed in centuries-old fashion. And there he was, Adrian. Except, he wasn't Adrian Kane. His name was whispered on her lips, but the moment she woke up, she had forgotten it. In the dream, she had danced with him, kissed him, until something shattered, and everything fell apart, and then she had died. Eleanor shut her laptop, pulse pounding. She had never believed in past lives, or fate, or any of that. But then Adrian Kane had looked at her like he'd known her for centuries. And now she wasn't so sure. At that exact moment, across the city, Adrian stood in the penthouse of his Manhattan tower, staring at the skyline. The room was dark except for the glow of a fireplace, casting flickering shadows against the glass walls. "You did a terrible job of staying hidden tonight," a smooth voice echoed behind him. Adrian didn't turn. "I wasn't trying to hide." Lucien Devereaux, Adrian's only true friend, and the only other immortal he knew, stepped forward, swirling a glass of whiskey. "You know who she is, don't you?" Lucien asked. Adrian exhaled. "Of course I do," Lucien chuckled, setting his drink down. "And yet you spoke to her. I couldn't stop myself. You never can." Adrian closed his eyes, jaw clenched. This wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Every lifetime she returned. Different names, different faces, but always her. And every lifetime, he lost her. Lucien sighed. "So what's the plan? Run this time? Or stay long enough to watch history repeat itself?" Adrian didn't answer, because deep down, he had a terrible feeling. He wasn't ready to lose her again, and that could destroy everything. Across the city, Valerian stood in the middle of an empty street, his golden eyes fixed on the night sky. The stars had shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but he had felt it. The weight of something changing. This wasn't just another cycle. The timeline was already beginning to unravel. Valerian sighed, pulling out his golden pocket watch and flicking it open. The hands on the clock twitched erratically, glitching between past and present. He clicked it shut. So, Adrian Kane had chosen not to run this time. Interesting. Very interesting. Eleanor barely slept that night. By morning, the dreams had consumed her. Those vivid memories of a life she didn't understand. Of a ballroom so old it felt like it belonged in another world. Adrian's face, the strange sense of déjà vu whenever she was near him. What was it? Why did it feel so real? She had spent the night combing through every scrap of information she could find about Adrian, but the more she uncovered, the more questions piled up. No family, no history, no trace of anything before his sudden appearance in 2009. It didn't add up. And yet, every fiber of her being screamed that Adrian Kane was connected to something beyond reason. At 2:34 p.m., her phone buzzed with a message. "Adrian Kane, if you're going to investigate me, you might as well do it over dinner." Eleanor stared at the screen. She should decline. A man like Adrian, mysterious, powerful, secretive, was not someone she needed to investigate any further, but her instincts screamed otherwise. She couldn't let it go. There was something here, something bigger than either of them could comprehend. Eleanor Hart, "Dinner implies answers, Mr. Kane. I don't do small talk." The reply was immediate. Adrian Kane, "Then I'll have to be interesting." Eleanor smirked. "Game on." The rooftop restaurant was breathtaking, suspended between the gleaming skyscrapers of Manhattan. Adrian stood at the edge of the terrace, looking out over the city. The golden hour light reflected off the glass and steel, casting long shadows. He turned when she approached, eyes narrowing slightly. "You came." "I didn't come for your charm," she said, keeping her tone playful, though her heart was racing. "I came for answers." Adrian raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement tugging at his lips. "You don't believe in charm, Ms. Hart?" Eleanor gave a short laugh. "I believe in answers, not smoke and mirrors." The waiter arrived, pouring wine as they sat down, the tension between them palpable. As much as Adrian wanted to remain guarded, he couldn't help but feel the weight of their connection. The air between them was charged with something undeniable. "So, let's get to it," Eleanor began, leaning forward. "Where did you come from, Adrian Kane? You seem like someone who has never belonged anywhere, yet you've built an empire. You're a man with no past." Adrian's expression shifted, the faintest hint of something darker crossing his features. But he quickly masked it. "I was born for the future." Eleanor paused, studying him carefully. "That's not an answer." A smirk tugged at his lips. "It's the only answer that matters." Eleanor let out a soft laugh, but there was a weight in his words that she couldn't ignore. She set her glass down and leaned in. "You're hiding something, Adrian. What is it?" Adrian didn't immediately answer. His gaze flicked briefly to the entrance, where a tall figure stood. It wasn't a figure he'd expected to see tonight. Valerian. Eleanor felt it too, the sudden drop in temperature, the shift in the room's energy. She turned, following Adrian's gaze. Standing at the entrance of the restaurant, in complete contrast to the elegance of the room, stood a man in dark, tailored clothing. His eyes, golden, burning through the dim light, were fixed on Adrian. "Who's that?" Eleanor asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew the answer. "Nobody important," Adrian said, standing abruptly. "I need to take care of something. Stay here." Eleanor watched as he made his way toward the figure. But before she could ask any more questions, a voice interrupted. "You shouldn't let him go," said the man with the golden eyes. Eleanor froze. The man didn't look at her, but she felt the weight of his presence, like a shadow slipping between the cracks of reality. "Who are you?" she asked, keeping her tone calm despite the cold sweat on her brow. The man smiled, his eyes gleaming with knowing. "I'm someone who has been watching Adrian for a very long time." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And you, Ms. Hart, are about to be caught up in something much larger than either of you can imagine." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She wanted to back away, but she couldn't. Something about him anchored her in place. Before she could react, Adrian's voice cut through the tension. "Valerian, enough." Eleanor turned, meeting Adrian's eyes. There was a subtle defensiveness in his posture, a quiet urgency, but it wasn't the tension in his voice that unsettled her. It was the hollow sadness in his eyes. Adrian turned to her, his expression unreadable. "We need to go." Valerian's smile faded as he took a step back, almost as if he'd never been there at all. Eleanor's breath was shaky as she watched him leave, disappearing into the shadows without a sound. She felt the weight of his words hanging in the air, like a warning that had just come too late. "Adrian, what was that?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Adrian took a long breath, shaking his head. "You don't need to know. Not yet." Eleanor reached for him. "Adrian, you can't just leave me with questions like this. What is happening?" He didn't look at her. Instead, he stared at the floor, clearly lost in thought. Finally, he met her gaze, his voice low and full of a sadness that ached. "I should have told you sooner," he whispered. "But now, you're already too deep." Eleanor shook her head, unable to fathom what he meant. Too deep for what? Adrian inhaled sharply. To escape. Eleanor barely slept that night, her mind racing. The shadows of the ballroom, Adrian's words, and Valerian's cryptic warnings tangled in her thoughts. She couldn't shake the sensation that something ancient was at work, something that went beyond mere chance. By the time dawn crept through her apartment windows, Eleanor had made a decision. She would not let Adrian Kane remain a ghost in her life. She would find out what was happening, no matter what it cost. The next morning, as the early sun filtered through the trees, Eleanor pulled on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, grabbing her coat as she stormed out of the apartment. There was something she needed to do, something she hadn't dared before. She needed answers from Adrian. She arrived at Adrian's penthouse by noon, her breath shallow with anticipation. The doorman nodded knowingly as she entered. She had seen Adrian leave that morning for meetings, but something told her that today she would confront him. There was no more running. The elevator doors opened, and Eleanor stepped out, the space of his penthouse spreading before her. But Adrian wasn't there. A sharp pang of disappointment shot through her, but it was quickly replaced by something stronger, an odd sense of relief. He had hidden from her, and yet, she knew in the pit of her stomach that this meeting had been coming. She moved into the living room, pacing, before stopping in front of the window. Outside, the city stretched out like a living entity, an endless maze of stories and secrets. She pressed her hands against the cold glass, staring at the world below. Then, she felt it, Adrian's presence. He stepped into the room, the door closing softly behind him. She turned, her eyes narrowing. "We need to talk." Adrian stared at her for a long moment, as if measuring her resolve. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I know. I'm sorry for disappearing on you earlier. I didn't want to pull you deeper into this." Eleanor didn't flinch. "It's too late for that, Adrian. You've already pulled me in." He exhaled sharply. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want you to know the truth." "Too late for that too," Eleanor said, crossing her arms. "Now tell me everything." Adrian met her gaze, his storm-gray eyes clouded with something darker. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly wrestling with the decision he had made long ago. He hesitated. "I never told you the truth. Not the real truth. I'm not like other people, Eleanor." Eleanor took a step closer, her voice steady. "Try me." Adrian swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, his shoulders slumped, and he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm immortal." Eleanor blinked, her mind struggling to wrap around the words. "Immortal?" Adrian nodded. "Not in the way you think. Not invincible. Not unbreakable. But I've lived for 5 centuries. He looked away, pain flashing across his face. "I made a deal with someone who shouldn't exist. Valerian." Eleanor's chest tightened. The name hit her like a cold wave. "Valerian?" Adrian nodded again. "He's not a man, not truly. He's something older, a caretaker of time. He watches over it, shapes it. And when I lost you, I went to him for help. I thought I could save you. And he gave me a choice." Eleanor's heart raced. "A choice?" Adrian nodded grimly. "He promised me immortality if I agreed to never be with you again. He said it was the price of eternity, that the two of us, bound by fate, were never meant to be. If I interfered with time, we would both be destroyed, and in exchange for your life, I lost my humanity." Eleanor's breath caught. "So this whole time, you've been living under a curse?" Adrian closed his eyes. "Yes, a curse that I willingly accepted." He opened his eyes and met hers. "But it wasn't supposed to be like this. We weren't supposed to find each other again." Eleanor's mind reeled, but a small, nagging part of her felt like she had always known. "You said we weren't supposed to find each other," she whispered. "But we did." Adrian took a step toward her, his voice quiet but desperate. "Eleanor, if you stay with me, if you choose to love me, it will end in tragedy. It always does." Eleanor shook her head. "You don't get to decide that." Adrian's expression faltered, his voice breaking slightly. "I've watched you die more times than I can count. And every time, I lose a piece of myself." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Then maybe it's time you started living for yourself, Adrian." Adrian looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, he didn't look so sure. "Adrian, you have a choice," Eleanor said, taking his hand. "You don't have to keep running, and neither do I. We're here, and we're alive, and for once, this time, we can make our own fate." His hand trembled in hers, but it wasn't with fear. It was something else, something raw. "I don't know how," Adrian whispered. "How do we break the cycle? How do we stop history from repeating itself?" Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with quiet resolve. "We stop living like we're already dead." Adrian exhaled, his gaze softening as he took a step back. "I don't know if we can." Eleanor's hand clenched around his. "Then let's try." They stood together in the silence of the penthouse, the hum of the city just below them. Adrian's eyes met hers one last time, and this time, there was no hesitation. This time, they would fight for it. The following days were a blur. Eleanor could hardly remember what she'd done before that night, before Adrian had opened up to her, before he had finally let go of the secret that had been gnawing at him for centuries. She found herself in a constant state of confusion and revelation. The unimaginable was now real, and the truth was something she could neither deny nor escape. Every conversation with Adrian felt like stepping into an entirely new world. His immortality wasn't just a fact of his existence. It was a wound that had never healed. The weight of their shared history was pressing on her, but instead of distracting her, it was fueling her resolve. She wasn't going to let him retreat again, not when he had already opened up so much. Not when they were so close to breaking the cycle that had kept them apart for so long. Eleanor stood at the window of his penthouse, the city sprawling below her. She could hear the faint hum of life, carriages, taxis, pedestrians, everything moving forward while she stood frozen in the moment, grappling with the overwhelming reality of Adrian's confession. She was no longer just a journalist uncovering the mysterious billionaire. She was part of something greater. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized. She had always been a part of this. She had always belonged to Adrian in some way, even if she hadn't known it. Footsteps behind her broke her train of thought. Adrian. She didn't need to turn around to know it was him. She could feel his presence now, the same way she could feel the subtle tension in the air, like an electric charge waiting to break free. "Eleanor?" he asked softly, his voice barely a whisper against the silence of the room. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly before turning to face him. "I've been thinking about what you said," she replied, her tone steady but carrying the weight of what she was about to ask. Adrian raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, almost fearful. And she looked him in the eye, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to talk about the contract." Adrian's face froze. That was the last thing he wanted to discuss. "I know you're afraid," she continued, stepping closer. "But I don't care about fate or destiny. I care about us, Adrian. I care about you." Adrian's jaw clenched as he turned his gaze toward the floor. The words felt like knives. He couldn't bear to hear them, because he knew what was coming next. "No, Eleanor." His voice was hoarse. "You don't understand. The deal I made with Valerian, it's not something we can just break. There are consequences. Things worse than losing me." Eleanor reached out, her fingers grazing his. "What if the worst thing is not trying? What if the worst thing is letting fate win?" Adrian's eyes flickered with pain, a faint flash of the man he used to be before immortality had taken its toll. "I'm not afraid of losing you. I'm afraid of dragging you into this hell with me." Eleanor's gaze softened. She touched his cheek gently, urging him to meet her eyes. "But I've already chosen." Adrian's breath hitched. His heart clenched painfully. She was right. He couldn't keep holding back, couldn't keep denying her the choice she had already made. Adrian stepped back, his hand instinctively reaching for the pocket where he had kept his pocket watch. He hadn't looked at it in ages, but now, as he pulled it free from his coat, it seemed like the only connection he had left to a life he no longer lived. "This is the only thing I have left of the life I once lived," he whispered, holding it up. The watch's hands moved impossibly fast, unpredictably, as if not bound by time at all. Eleanor stared at it, a strange sense of unease settling in her chest. "What is it?" "This," he said, his fingers tightening around the watch, "is how I've lived for so long, how I've kept one foot in the present and one foot in the past." Adrian exhaled slowly, finally looking at her with a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "This watch is how I've stayed in control, how I've held on to something that made sense of all this chaos. But now it's breaking." Eleanor tilted her head. "Breaking?" Adrian closed his eyes briefly before continuing. "I've been running from what I did, Eleanor, from the price I paid to keep you safe. Valerian gave me immortality, but he gave me the cost of eternity, watching you die, over and over again, while I stayed the same." Her heart ached. "That's not living, Adrian. That's a prison." "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I've never known how to escape it." Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes locked onto his. "Then let me show you how." For the first time in centuries, Adrian felt something shift inside him, a whisper of a life he hadn't dared imagine in over 500 years. "Eleanor, this..." He hesitated. "It's a risk." "I'm not afraid of risks," she replied, her voice unwavering. "You're not alone anymore. We can break this together." Adrian stared at her for a long time, the weight of his choices pressing on him. There were so many unknowns, so many things that could go wrong, but one thing was certain. For the first time, he wasn't fighting alone. Adrian held the watch tightly in his hand, then gently placed it back in his pocket. He took a deep breath. "All right," he whispered. "We do this, but we do it together." Eleanor smiled softly, stepping forward and taking his hand. Together. And for the first time in his long, unending life, Adrian felt the weight of time lift. Eleanor had always believed that life had a way of throwing curveballs, unexpected, jarring moments that made everything feel uncertain. But nothing had prepared her for the shift she felt the moment she stepped fully into Adrian's world. When she made the choice to stand by him, to face whatever fate had planned for them, something deep within her began to shift too. Adrian wasn't just some mysterious billionaire. He was a man who had lived through centuries, who had watched life slip through his fingers, and who had paid a price no one should ever have to. But he wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. Adrian sat in front of the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows across his face. His hand rested on the arm of the chair, his fingers flexing occasionally, as though still adjusting to the sensation of being mortal. He was no longer immune to time's effects. He felt every heartbeat, every fleeting moment. For the first time in centuries, the passage of time wasn't just a distant concept. It was his reality. He glanced at Eleanor, who was perched on the edge of the couch, her eyes focused on him as if trying to solve a puzzle that even he didn't understand. "I thought this would feel different," Adrian murmured, the words coming out more to himself than to her. "I thought I would feel whole." Eleanor tilted her head, her gaze softening. "What do you feel now?" He shifted in his seat, rubbing the back of his neck. "Tired, alive, vulnerable." He laughed bitterly. "But maybe that's the price of being human." Eleanor walked over to him, kneeling by his side, her hand resting lightly on his knee. "Maybe it's not about being vulnerable, Adrian. Maybe it's about being present." Adrian turned his eyes to her, something shifting in his chest. "Present. I've spent 500 years running, trying to outrun what I knew would catch up to me. Time always did, but I never thought I'd face it as something real." Eleanor's fingers gently traced the outline of his hand. "And now, You get to live with it. With me. Adrian swallowed, the weight of her words hitting him harder than he expected. I don't know how to do that, Eleanor. How do you move forward when you've been trapped for so long? She smiled softly. By living. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, exhaling as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. I don't know if I can. Eleanor squeezed his hand, her grip strong, unwavering. You don't have to do it alone, Adrian. His eyes met hers, the depth of his uncertainty clear. But there was something else there too, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. But as the hours passed and the night grew darker, a sense of foreboding settled in the air. The weight of their decision wasn't as light as they had hoped. The price of breaking the eternal contract was not something that could simply be ignored. Adrian's chest tightened as he looked out the window, his gaze scanning the cityscape. There was no more running. He had made the choice to change everything, to face whatever came next. But it felt like the universe was already fighting back. There was a soft knock at the door. Adrian's breath hitched. He had hoped for a moment's peace, but deep down, he knew better. The past had a way of catching up. Eleanor raised an eyebrow as Adrian stood, his hand tightening on the back of the chair. Who is it? She asked quietly. Adrian's expression darkened. Someone who doesn't take no for an answer. He moved toward the door, his footsteps steady but laced with the faintest hint of nervous anticipation. He wasn't sure what was waiting on the other side, but the presence at the door was a reminder of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. Adrian opened the door. Valerian stood in the hallway, his golden eyes gleaming, his expression cold and detached. I knew you'd try this, Valerian said, stepping into the room without waiting for permission. It's always the same. Adrian stood tall, his jaw clenched. What do you want, Valerian? Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. What are you here for? Valerian's eyes flickered between them, and for a moment, there was something almost regretful in his gaze. But it disappeared as quickly as it appeared. You've broken the contract, Adrian, and now you must face the consequences. Adrian's blood ran cold. I've faced consequences for centuries. I'm not afraid of your threats anymore. Valerian's lips curled into a smirk. You should be, because you're no longer the only one in control. He turned to Eleanor. You think you can just walk away from fate? You can't. Eleanor stood her ground. We've made our choice, Valerian, and nothing you do will change that. For a moment, Valerian didn't speak. His gaze flickered from Eleanor to Adrian, his expression unreadable. You've always been so sure of yourselves, he murmured, almost to himself. But you've failed to realize that you're not the only ones with power. Time itself has a way of resetting things. Adrian took a step forward, his voice low. If you think you can erase us, Valerian, you're mistaken. Valerian's eyes glinted with amusement. We'll see, Kane. He turned, his form flickering in and out of sight, as if time itself was bending around him. And then, he was gone. Eleanor stood silently, staring at the spot where Valerian had been. A cold feeling crept up her spine, but she refused to show fear. We have to be ready, she said, her voice steady. Adrian turned to face her, his eyes still shadowed with uncertainty. I don't know what comes next, Eleanor. I don't know how to fight time itself. She stepped closer, placing her hand on his chest. We don't have to fight it alone. We're in this together. Adrian swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling deep inside him. This was the moment. He had chosen her, and now there was no turning back. Together, they would face whatever came next. Adrian pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. I don't know what will happen, but I'm not afraid anymore. Eleanor smiled softly, her face pressed against his chest. Then let's see what the future holds. Together, the world had changed. Adrian could feel it in every breath he took. The air was heavier now, as though the fabric of reality itself had become frayed, stretched too thin by his decision to break the eternal contract. He stared out over the city from the penthouse, his eyes searching the horizon, as if he might see something, anything that would tell him what came next. Eleanor had been right to push him, to demand that they face this together. But even as he stood there, feeling the weight of his choices, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer in control. The days after Valerian's visit had been a blur. Every time Adrian closed his eyes, he felt the presence of the ancient being, a shadow that lurked just beyond his reach, watching. The world seemed to be holding its breath, as if the universe were waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the consequences of his actions to unfold. Eleanor had remained by his side, unwavering, but Adrian could see the worry in her eyes, the same worry he felt gnawing at his insides. What would happen next? He had broken the rules of time itself, and the universe wasn't known for forgiving mistakes like that. But there was no turning back now. There was no going back to the way things were. I don't like this, Adrian murmured, standing by the window. His fingers drummed against the glass. It feels like we're just waiting for something to happen. Eleanor joined him, her hand resting on his arm. We're not waiting. We're living. Adrian turned to her, her unwavering support the only thing grounding him in this moment. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, he closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. She didn't hesitate to hold him back. If you are enjoying the story, help us by subscribing to the channel. And please leave a comment to let us know what you're thinking about the story. This is of huge importance to us. Her warmth seeping through the fabric of his clothes, reminding him that they were not alone. Together, he whispered, the word a vow, no matter what happens. Eleanor nodded, her cheek resting against his chest. Together. It was the following evening when the first true sign of the consequences arrived. Adrian had always known that his actions would have repercussions, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment when the clock's hands began to move backward. The sky outside darkened abruptly, and the air grew thick with tension. It felt as though something was being pulled taut, like the string of a bow that had been drawn too far. Eleanor froze, sensing it too. Her eyes flicked toward Adrian, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. We're not alone, she said softly. Adrian didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. The sense of time unraveling was growing stronger, a wave of cold rushing through his veins. Then, he heard it. A knock on the door. Slow, measured, the kind of knock you only hear when you know the person on the other side isn't there to deliver good news. Adrian moved to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel it now, the shifting, the weight of the choice he had made settling over him. The past was coming back to collect its debt. He opened the door, and there, standing in the hallway, was a figure he knew all too well, Valerian. But this time, the man didn't stand alone. Beside him was another figure, someone far more unsettling, a woman. Her eyes gleamed like liquid silver, and her smile was sharp, dangerous. Adrian, Valerian said, his voice cold, but there was an undercurrent of something more, something dark. Do we have to do this? Adrian asked, his voice hoarse. What do you want from us? The woman stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor, and Adrian felt the weight of her gaze like a physical force pressing against him. I'm here because of you, she said, her voice smooth and predatory. You've disrupted the natural order, Cain, and now the cost must be paid. Eleanor stepped forward, positioning herself between Adrian and the strangers. What do you mean by cost? The woman's lips curled into a smile. You, Eleanor Hart, are a thread woven into a much larger tapestry. Your existence was never meant to be entwined with his. Adrian felt his blood run cold. He had never imagined that the consequences of his choices would come for Eleanor too. He had opened the door to this, but he wasn't willing to let her suffer because of it. What do you want? He asked again, his voice harder this time. Valerian stepped closer, his eyes cold and calculating. The cycle can't be broken without a price. You've already taken more than your share, Adrian, and now you must make a choice. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as he looked between the two strangers, fear clawing at him. What kind of choice? The woman stepped closer to Eleanor, her smile widening. A sacrifice. Adrian stood frozen, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He could feel the weight of time, the ancient forces that governed his life, gathering like a storm. Eleanor looked at him, her expression calm, but her eyes full of something more powerful than fear. I'm not leaving, she said, her voice steady. We're in this together. Valerian's gaze flickered to her, his expression unreadable. You don't understand, do you? He turned back to Adrian. You'll need to sacrifice her in order to undo the damage you've caused. The words hit Adrian like a blow. Sacrifice Eleanor? How could he ever make such a choice? Adrian shook his head, stepping in front of Eleanor, blocking her from their view. No, I won't do that. I refuse to choose between her and my soul. Valerian sighed, the expression on his face growing more weary. The price of immortality, Adrian, is that you must be willing to lose everything. And if you refuse, the consequences will be far greater than either of you could imagine. Eleanor reached out, her hand resting on Adrian's arm. We will choose together. Whatever it takes, we will face this together. Adrian turned to her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had lost her before, in 1,000 lifetimes. But this time, he would fight for her. You're right, he whispered, the decision settling in his chest like a steel resolve. We fight. Together. Valerian's eyes flashed with something dangerous, but he didn't move. The woman beside him only smiled, as if she had already won, but Adrian knew better now. He was no longer running, and he wasn't going to lose Eleanor again. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as Valerian and the mysterious woman watched him, their cold eyes like ice cutting through the room. The tension between them was palpable, an invisible wall that pushed him back, forcing him to make the impossible decision he had been trying to avoid for centuries. The choice had come at last, and the weight of it was heavier than anything he had ever faced. Eleanor stood at his side, her presence a comfort and a strength, but even her unwavering support couldn't stop the fear from swirling inside him. The woman stepped forward, her movement graceful and predatory. "You understand, don't you, Adrian?" she said softly. "In order to break the cycle, you must let go of what you hold most dear." Adrian clenched his fists at his sides, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "No," his voice was firm, despite the flood of emotions crashing through him. "I won't sacrifice her. I won't lose her again." Valerian watched him with a quiet, unsettling amusement. "You know what the consequences will be. Time cannot be rewritten without a price. You're asking for the impossible." Eleanor's hand slipped into his, a silent promise that they would face this together. "We've already made our choice, Adrian." She stepped closer, her voice steady but filled with determination. "We choose each other." Adrian's eyes met hers, and in that moment, the weight of everything he had lived through, every century, every lost lifetime, seemed to shift. For the first time, he wasn't alone in this fight. "Together," Adrian whispered. The words felt final, as if they sealed something, a bond that neither time nor fate could sever. The woman's smile twisted into something darker. "Very well, but understand this. Adrian Kane, fate has already decided your path." She raised her hand, and for a moment, the room seemed to bend. The air thickened, like a storm waiting to strike. And then, suddenly, a sharp pain erupted in Adrian's chest. He gasped, his vision blurring, and he staggered back, gripping the edge of the table for support. Eleanor gasped, stepping forward in panic. "Adrian, what's happening?" The pain was searing. Something was pulling at him, deep, unrelenting, like an invisible force trying to rip him apart. He gritted his teeth, trying to focus through the haze of agony. "It's too late," Valerian said, his voice dark with finality. "You've chosen to defy time, to reject the price that must be paid, and now you will face it." "No," Eleanor cried, rushing to his side. She reached out to him, her fingers brushing against his skin, and something shifted. Adrian's heart raced as she touched him. The pain lessened. Not completely, but it faded just enough that he could breathe again. "You're not alone," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You're with me, Adrian. Always." His breath came in ragged gasps, but as he looked into her eyes, something in him clicked. The storm of pain began to ebb away, and the pressure that had built in his chest started to loosen. He squeezed her hand, trying to steady himself. "Eleanor, I don't understand." Eleanor's gaze never wavered. "You don't have to. We've broken the cycle before. We'll do it again." Valerian stood still, watching the scene unfold with an expression of quiet admiration. "You've truly defied fate, haven't you?" he mused. "It's unexpected, but it won't be enough." The woman beside him took a step forward, her eyes flickering with growing malice. "Time doesn't bend for just anyone. There are rules, Adrian, and you've broken them." But Adrian stood tall, his body still shaking but his resolve stronger than ever. "Then I'll rewrite the rules." Eleanor's presence at his side steadied him, her determination, her refusal to give in. He felt it inside him, like a fire he hadn't realized he needed. "I will not lose her again," he said, his voice firm, unwavering, "and I will not let you take her from me." Valerian's golden eyes flashed. "You're brave, Adrian, but this is not a fight you can win." Eleanor raised her chin. "I'm done with your threats, Valerian. Whatever your plan is, it ends here." There was a sudden shift in the air. A surge of energy crackled around them, a crack in time itself opening up. Eleanor grabbed Adrian's hand tighter, holding him steady as the world around them seemed to collapse and reform. Something snapped. Adrian could feel it, a force of nature, impossible to understand, yet so powerful that it felt as though the very fabric of reality had been torn. His vision swirled with colors and shapes, flashes of moments long past and futures yet to come. He saw lifetime after lifetime, all the versions of himself and Eleanor across time, all the times they had failed. But this time was different. He heard a voice, familiar, like a whisper of memory. It wasn't Valerian. It wasn't even the universe itself. It was something deeper, older, and more powerful than anything Adrian had encountered before. "You've broken the chains, Adrian Kane." The voice echoed through him, shaking him to the core. "And now you must choose." Adrian's chest tightened, his pulse racing. "I've already chosen," the voice responded, the words resonating within him. "Then the future is yours. Not just for you, but for her as well." Duh. The storm of energy faded. The air grew still once again, and suddenly, the pressure, the agony, it was gone. Adrian blinked, looking around the room, but the woman and Valerian had disappeared. The space around them was unchanged, but the tension in the air had lifted. He turned to Eleanor, who was watching him, her face a mixture of relief and wonder. "Did we?" Adrian whispered, his voice still hoarse. "Did we win?" Eleanor smiled softly, stepping toward him, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "We didn't just win, Adrian. We reclaimed our future. Adrian stared at her, disbelief still written on his face. For the first time in centuries, he felt like a man who could live without fear, a man who was no longer bound to time's cruel whim. Together, they had broken the cycle, and now they were free. The world outside felt different now. The streets of Manhattan, which had once seemed so cold and distant, were now alive with possibility, bathed in the soft glow of a morning that felt as though it were the first sunrise. Adrian and Eleanor stood together on the balcony of his penthouse, overlooking the city that had been the backdrop to so many lifetimes of his existence. The weight of their decision was still fresh, but the lingering tension that had clung to him for centuries seemed to have evaporated. For the first time in his life, Adrian wasn't worried about the next day, the next decade, or even the next century. He was finally living in the now. Eleanor stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his. Her presence felt like a steady heartbeat in a world that had once seemed like an endless, timeless blur. They had done the impossible, and now they could finally start over. Adrian turned his gaze to her, his heart still adjusting to the reality of what they had just done. The storm that had threatened to tear them apart was gone, and in its wake was a quiet, hopeful silence. "It's not a dream, is it?" Adrian murmured, his voice hushed. Eleanor smiled, her eyes gleaming in the soft light. "If it is, it's the one I've been waiting for." Adrian chuckled softly, the sound deep and genuine, as he looked out at the city once more. "I don't even know what to do with this. The feeling of time, of it moving, of it actually being real." "You'll get used to it," Eleanor said, squeezing his hand. "And so will I." Adrian met her gaze again. "You don't regret it? What we've done?" Eleanor's smile widened, not for a second. The days that followed were different. Not just because Adrian was now human, mortal, but because for the first time, he and Eleanor could truly breathe. The world was no longer an endless series of lifetimes. Instead, they were free to live as they chose. Adrian wasn't used to the mundanity of life. His days had always been dictated by the weight of time, by the ancient burden of immortality. But now, with Eleanor by his side, he began to relearn how to live, without fear, without the looming shadow of the past hanging over him. They walked the streets of the city, hand in hand, like any couple might, stopping to grab coffee, talking about everything and nothing, enjoying the simple things that he had long forgotten. But even in the quiet moments, there was a sense of expectancy. Time had a way of shifting beneath them, a reminder that no matter how far they'd come, the forces that had shaped their lives were not entirely gone. "Do you ever think about what could have been?" Eleanor asked one afternoon, her voice casual, though Adrian could hear the undercurrent of something deeper. Adrian paused, glancing down at her. "I try not to. If I start thinking about the past, I'll lose sight of what we have now." She nodded, her fingers tightening around his. "I just wonder about the versions of us that never got a chance, the ones who never found each other. What happened to them?" Adrian's heart skipped a beat. The idea of the endless versions of themselves, each one finding their own way and failing, sometimes tragically, was something he had never truly allowed himself to dwell on. But now, with Eleanor's words hanging in the air, he couldn't ignore the truth. They had fought against a timeline that had wanted to keep them apart, but we're here now, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of their shared journey. "And that's all that matters." Eleanor smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "Yeah, I guess it is." But even as they settled into their new reality, the echoes of the past weren't far behind. Late one evening, as they sat together in Adrian's apartment, there was a sharp knock on the door. It wasn't a sound they were used to hearing. No visitor had dared show up in the aftermath of their decision. Not yet, at least. Adrian's instincts kicked in. He stood up, his body tense as he moved toward the door. Eleanor followed him, her own steps cautious. "Who is it?" Adrian didn't answer, his hand resting on the doorknob, his thoughts racing. His body was still adjusting to the feeling of vulnerability, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever came next. He opened the door, and standing before him was Lucian. Adrian's heart skipped a beat. Lucian, a fellow immortal, the one person who had always known the truth of what Adrian had endured, stood there with a look of quiet understanding on his face. "Lucian," Adrian said, his voice tight. "What are you doing here?" Lucian's gaze flickered to Eleanor before meeting Adrian's again. "I didn't think you'd actually pull it off. I thought you'd run, like you always do." Adrian crossed his arms. "I'm done running, Lucian." Lucian smiled faintly. "I can see that." He stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation. "But there's something you need to understand. It's not over." Eleanor stepped forward, her expression a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "What do you mean? We broke the cycle. We have our future." Lucian's eyes softened as he looked at her. "Yes. But you've angered powers older than you can imagine. The forces that control time, they don't let go so easily." Adrian's stomach dropped. "What are you saying?" Lucian's gaze turned serious. "You might have broken the contract, but you haven't broken the laws of time itself. They're coming for you. Adrian's world seemed to shift on its axis. This was it, the moment he had feared. Despite everything they had done to rewrite the past, to break free of the curse that had bound them for centuries, the universe was not done with them. What do we do? Eleanor asked, her voice steady but full of urgency. Lucian took a breath, his face grim. You can't fight what's coming. You can only prepare. Adrian clenched his fists, staring at Lucian. How do we prepare? We've done everything to defy fate. How much more do we have to sacrifice? Lucian met his gaze. Fate will always demand a price, but now it's your choice. Whether you pay it, or whether you fight back once more. Eleanor stood beside Adrian, her gaze unwavering. We fight, Lucien nodded slowly. Then let's get ready, because whatever happens next, it won't be easy. Adrian took a deep breath, standing taller, feeling the weight of their future settle over him. I'm done running. If the universe wants a fight, I'll give it one. The city was alive beneath them, its pulse a constant beat that thrummed through the streets, through the air, through everything. But for Adrian and Eleanor, the world had become a waiting game, one they hadn't expected to play. Lucian had left them with little more than ominous words. The laws of time were as old as the universe itself, and no matter how many lives they had rewritten, no matter how many cycles they had broken, they were now caught in its grasp. Adrian stood on the balcony, staring out at the city, his thoughts heavy. He had spent centuries running from the inevitable, but now the consequences were clear. They had made their choice, together, but that didn't mean it would be easy. Eleanor joined him quietly, her hand resting on the railing beside his. We can't just wait around for them to come for us, she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Adrian exhaled, his chest tight. I don't think we're just waiting anymore, Eleanor. I think this is the fight we were meant to have. They spent the next several days preparing. Lucian had told them that time itself was a force they couldn't easily defeat, and it would be a battle of more than just wills. It was a battle of existence. The very fabric of reality would decide if they succeeded or failed. Adrian knew he wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Eleanor was his strength, the one thing he had never had before, the one thing that had given him the courage to make the choices he never thought possible. But as the days passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. That night, as the clock ticked down to midnight, they both felt it, the air growing still, the tension thickening like a fog that they couldn't shake off. Adrian turned to Eleanor. It's here. His voice was taut, filled with the weight of everything they had done to get to this point. Eleanor met his gaze. We're not going down without a fight. They both knew what was coming, but neither of them could have fully prepared for what happened next. The doors to the penthouse burst open, and before they could react, Valerian and the woman from before stepped inside, their presence overwhelming. Adrian's pulse quickened. This was no longer a confrontation. This was the final moment of reckoning. Valerian stepped forward, his expression unreadable. You should have known this wasn't going to end the way you wanted, he said, his voice calm, but filled with the weight of centuries of existence. The woman beside him raised her chin, a small, almost imperceptible smirk crossing her lips. You've done well to fight this long, but now, your rebellion ends. Adrian squared his shoulders, stepping in front of Eleanor, a protective instinct rising in him. I won't back down, Valerian. We've already won. Valerian's golden eyes flashed. You think so? You've broken the laws of time, and now you think you can simply rewrite it? That's not how this works. Adrian took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had spent centuries avoiding fate, and had been trapped in a cycle of loss. But now, for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't running. I've already made my choice, Adrian said, his voice steady. And so has she. He nodded to Eleanor. Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. We choose our own future. You can't dictate that for us anymore. The woman's eyes narrowed. You think you can change everything? Adrian met her gaze, his heart thumping in his chest. We already have. And with that, he reached out and took Eleanor's hand, squeezing it tightly. The energy in the room shifted again, faint ripples of power racing through them both. They were ready. Valerian's smirk faltered for the briefest of moments. It was as if something had cracked, just for an instant, and Adrian could see it, the tension in the air thickening, a storm of power swirling between them. You've already broken so much, Valerian said, his voice now more dangerous, more frenzied. But you haven't broken time. Adrian felt a sharp pain in his chest again, like time itself was trying to wrench him away. But this time, Eleanor's hand in his steadied him, anchoring him to the moment. This is our choice, Valerian, Eleanor said firmly. We've already chosen each other, and that choice won't be undone. The woman stepped forward, her silver eyes flickering with a dark light. Then we'll see how long your choice lasts when time itself is against you. Suddenly the air cracked, and time seemed to bend in on itself. Adrian and Eleanor were surrounded by a wave of force, a pressure so immense it felt like it was squeezing the very life out of them. Adrian felt the pain in his chest again, sharper this time. He gasped, his vision flickering. Time was trying to break them, but Eleanor didn't falter. She squeezed his hand again, pulling him through the storm of energy that threatened to overwhelm them. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice fierce, determined. "We fight this, together." And in that moment, he understood. They weren't fighting just for themselves. They were fighting for everything they had ever lost, for every lifetime they had been torn apart, for the future they had finally claimed. Eleanor wasn't just his anchor, she was his purpose. Adrian closed his eyes, breathing through the pain, feeling the force of the universe pressing in on him. And then, with a force greater than he had ever known, he let go of his fear. The pressure began to shatter. Time itself screamed. It was a battle of wills. Adrian's and Eleanor's love against the forces of eternity that had tried to tear them apart. The storm around them intensified, but Adrian felt it, felt the breaking point. They were stronger together, and with that thought, the universe cracked. The force pushing them back suddenly stopped. The pressure vanished, leaving only the stillness of a world that had finally been set right. Adrian opened his eyes, and the first thing he saw was Eleanor's face. Her eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted in disbelief. I think we did it," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Adrian laughed, the sound raw and full of emotion. "I think we did too." The room was still. Valerian and the woman were gone. The air was finally clear, and for the first time in centuries, Adrian felt like he had a future. He turned to Eleanor, his heart swelling with emotion. "We're free." Eleanor smiled, stepping into his arms. "We are." And for the first time in their long, twisted journey, Adrian and Eleanor stood in the present, together, with no past to haunt them, no future to fear, only a love that had defied time itself. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription will show that I'm on the right path to bring you the best videos ever. And if you enjoyed this video, check this one out too.